The air in the 14th floor boardroom tasted faintly of stale espresso and corporate panic. When the new VP slammed his hand on the mahogany table, demanding absolute control, he didn't notice the quiet hum of the server rack or the heavy manila folder already sliding across the glass toward him. The neon lights of the corporate headquarters never truly turned off. They just dimmed to a predatory low-voltage hum between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning. On the 14th floor, the silence was absolute, thick enough to muffle the distant rhythmic thrum of the city below. Elena stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection suspended against the backdrop of a sleeping metropolis. In her hand, the porcelain of her coffee mug had long gone cold, but she held on to it anyway. A porcelain anchor keeping her grounded in a reality that was rapidly spinning out of control. The boardroom behind her felt like a stage waiting for an execution. The massive mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the pale, ambient glow of the city streets. Everything about this room screamed old money and absolute authority, a stark contrast to the digital invisible ink she had spent the last 72 hours tracing. She could still smell the faint, sharp tang of industrial carpet cleaner and the ghost of expensive cologne from yesterday's late-night executive briefing. It was the scent of a trap being laid, though the man walking into it still believed he was the hunter. She turned slowly, her heels clicking with a sharp, deliberate echo against the hardwood border of the room. On the center of the table sat a single heavy manila folder. It looked almost archaic in an era of cloud computing and biometric security. But that was precisely why she had printed it. Pixels could be deleted with a keystroke. Servers could mysteriously fail during an unscheduled maintenance window. But physical paper, bound by steel clips and stamped with internal audit serial numbers, possessed a stubborn, undeniable gravity. The folder was labeled simply, Report Section 8, Internal Fraud Review. For the past 6 months, the company had been bleeding capital through a network of shell vendors that looked entirely legitimate on a balance sheet. To the untrained eye, the payments were standard tech licensing fees, routine compliance audits, and offshore logistics consulting. But Elena didn't have an untrained eye. She had spent a decade building the very data tracking frameworks this company relied on. She knew where the digital skeletons were buried, because she had designed the cemetery. And right now, every single trail of crumbs led back to one specific digital signature. She checked her watch, 6:45 a.m. The first rays of a cold gray dawn were beginning to bleed through the clouds, slicing across the boardroom table like a blade. The stage was set, the evidence was locked in place, and the witnesses were already on their way up the elevator. She could feel the familiar icy rush of adrenaline tightening her chest, the thrill of the chess player who realizes they are exactly 3 moves away from a checkmate their opponent cannot even see yet. A soft chime echoed from the hallway, signaling the arrival of the executive elevator. The heavy glass doors slid open, and the silence of the 14th floor was instantly shattered by the aggressive, rapid-fire clicking of expensive leather shoes. The new vice president of operations entered the room like a minor deity arriving to inspect a failing colony. His tailored suit was immaculate, his hair perfectly gelled, and his face wore the smug, impenetrable mask of a man who believed his own press releases. Behind him, looking noticeably uncomfortable, trailed the heads of HR and legal, clutching their tablets like shields. "Let's make one thing abundantly clear before the rest of the board gets here," the VP barked, not even looking at Elena as he threw his leather briefcase onto the mahogany table. He leaned forward, planting his palms flat on the surface, his eyes locked onto the 2 department heads. "From now on, every single decision goes through me. No exceptions, no back-channel approvals, and no independent initiatives. If a pen moves in this building, I authorize the ink." The HR director shifted her weight, exchanging a nervous, fleeting glance with the general counsel. Nobody wanted to cross the new golden boy, especially not when he had the CEO's ear and a mandate to restructure the entire division. He was a corporate bulldozer, accustomed to flattening anyone who stood in his path, completely blind to the fact that the ground beneath his own tracks was entirely hollow. Elena didn't blink. She didn't argue, nor did she offer the defensive justification he was clearly baiting her for. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate sip of her cold coffee, set the mug down with a soft, metallic click, and stepped toward the table. With a calmness that seemed to lower the temperature of the room by 10 degrees, she reached out and slid a secondary, thinner folder across the glass. It slid with a soft hiss, stopping precisely 3 inches from his manicured hands. The label on the tab read, "Recorded_approvals." "You're absolutely right," Elena said, her voice a low conversational purr that cut through his manufactured tension effortlessly. "Control is everything, which is why I think you should take a look at these before you finalize your new policy." The VP frowned, his brow furrowing as he looked down at the folder. A faint flicker of irritation crossed his features, followed quickly by something else, a microscopic shadow of hesitation that only someone looking for it would notice. He didn't open it immediately. He couldn't. Because deep down, the first whispers of a terrible realization were beginning to echo in his mind, suggesting that he had just signed his own eviction notice from the upper echelon of power. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind of heavy pressurized quiet that precedes a lightning strike. The VP stared at the folder as if it were a dormant explosive. His fingers hovered over the cardboard edge, twitching slightly, before he finally flicked it open with an aggressive, performative snap. Inside lay a pristine stack of cryptographic ledger logs, each page watermarked with the company's secure internal routing stamps. There were no paragraphs of text, no corporate jargon, just raw, undeniable data columns, timestamps, IP addresses, alphanumeric transaction hashes, and, in the final column, a glowing digital authorization key that belonged exclusively to one person. Elena watched his face closely. The arrogant smirk didn't vanish all at once. It eroded piece by piece, like a sandcastle hit by a rising tide. The color slowly drained from his cheeks, leaving him a pasty, sickly gray beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. He scrambled through the first 3 pages, his movements losing their rehearsed fluidity, becoming frantic and erratic. This is a routine software licensing audit," he stammered, his voice losing its booming authority and jumping an octave. He looked up, trying to force a laugh that died in his throat, when he met Elena's deadpan gaze. "It's completely standard operational overhead. I sign off on dozens of these a month to keep our offshore infrastructure compliant." "It would be standard operational overhead," Elena replied smoothly, leaning back against the windowsill and crossing her arms. "If the vendor, Alpha Logistics Corp., actually existed. But according to the corporate registry in Delaware, that entity was dissolved 3 years ago. Yet, someone within this room has been approving monthly retainers of $85,000 to their offshore accounts." The HR director took a sharp, audible breath, her hand flying to her mouth. The general counsel immediately took a step closer to the table, his legal instincts kicking in as his eyes scanned the printed logs. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The VP was no longer the dictator of the 14th floor. He was a suspect, trapped in an interrogation room with nowhere left to run. "You think you're clever, don't you?" the VP hissed, his posture turning defensive as he slammed the folder shut. He tried to draw himself up to his full height, but the sweat glistening on his forehead betrayed the panic clawing at his throat. "You brought a bunch of circumstantial IT logs to HR to try and stage a coup?" "I was brought in by the board to clean house, and if you think you can frame me for—" "I didn't frame you," Elena interrupted, her voice dropping to a whisper that commanded more attention than his shouting ever could. "And I didn't bring this to HR. They are just here as witnesses to the notification process." She pointed a single elegant finger toward the large display screen at the end of the boardroom. The screen suddenly flickered to life, displaying a live document tracker connected to the executive suite downstairs. The status bar at the top of the monitor shifted from pending review to a bright flashing crimson. Approved/enforced. The VP's breath hitched. He spun around to look at the screen, his eyes widening in pure horror as he realized he had been fighting the wrong battle all morning. While he had been busy trying to intimidate Elena and assert his dominance over the middle management, the real hammer had already dropped elsewhere. By exactly 7:03 a.m., the chief operating officer had opened his encrypted terminal on the floor below. He didn't need a briefing, and he didn't need an explanation. He had spent the last 15 minutes reviewing Report Section 8 Internal Fraud Review, tracking the digital breadcrumbs that Elena had meticulously laid out for him over the past 72 hours. Every shell company, every diverted invoice, and every single unauthorized wire transfer had been laid bare in agonizing, high-definition detail. The general counsel stepped forward, his voice cold and devoid of any professional warmth as he looked at the sweating executive. "Every approval leads back to him," he said quietly, addressing the room but looking directly at the VP. Silence descended on the boardroom once more, absolute and final. The VP opened his mouth to speak, to offer one last desperate lie, but the words failed him. He stood frozen, staring at the flashing red text on the monitor, completely aware that his brilliant corporate career had just hit a concrete wall at full speed. And the worst part was, the police were already downstairs. The trap is sprung. Will you witness the fallout? The corporate ladder is slippery, but it's the drop from the top that breaks you. The VP's empire has crumbled before his morning coffee could even cool, but a cornered animal is always the most dangerous. Will he go down quietly? Or is he about to drag the entire C-suite into the abyss with him? Elena's real battle is just beginning. Don't miss the next move in this high-stakes game of corporate chess. The silence in the boardroom didn't just linger. It solidified, turning into a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to trap the oxygen in everyone's lungs. The VP stood paralyzed, his fingers still awkwardly gripping the edges of the mahogany table, as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling through the floor. His eyes darted from Elena to the flashing red notification on the monitor, then to the legal counsel, frantically looking for a loophole, a delay tactic, or a shred of corporate mercy that no longer existed. The general counsel didn't give him the chance to find one. He calmly reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a sleek encrypted company smartphone, and tapped the screen twice. "Security," he said, his voice entirely flat, stripped of any human emotion. "14th floor boardroom. We have an immediate administrative suspension. Please bring the escort detail." A sharp, violent tremor ran through the VP's shoulders. The realization that he wasn't just being fired, but systematically erased from the organization, finally broke through his wall of executive denial. He let go of the table, took a ragged step backward, and looked at Elena with a mixture of raw hatred and pure desperation. The smooth, rehearsed savior of the company had vanished, replaced by a panicked man caught with his hand deep in the digital vault. "You don't understand how this works, Elena," he hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper as he tried to claw back some semblance of leverage. He stepped closer to her, ignoring the HR director who instinctively moved out of his way. "You think you've uncovered a solo operation? You think I'm the only one who signed off on these vendors? If you pull this thread, the entire regional infrastructure unravels. The CEO knew about the offshore buffers. Everyone knew." Elena didn't move an inch. She didn't flinch at his sudden proximity, nor did she look surprised by his attempt to implicate the rest of the executive suite. In the corporate ecosystem, blame shifting was as natural as breathing, especially when the ship began to sink. She merely looked down at his trembling hands, then back up to his eyes, her expression as unreadable as a blank server log. "I know exactly how this works," Elena replied, her voice dangerously calm. which is why I didn't stop at your digital signature. If you look at page 14 of the report the COO is currently reading, you'll find the secondary routing numbers. Every single dollar that left those shell companies went into a private account registered to your LLC in the Cayman Islands. Not the CEO's, not the company's infrastructure fund. Yours. The VP opened his mouth to retort, but the words withered in his throat. His chest heaved as he tried to process the fact that she hadn't just watched the money leave. She had followed it all the way to its final secret destination. The trap wasn't just airtight, it was a reinforced concrete vault, and she had just turned the lock from the outside. Right on cue, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom chimed again. Two uniformed security guards stepped into the room, their expressions grim and professional. They didn't look at Elena, and they didn't look at the legal team. Their eyes locked instantly onto the VP, their posture making it explicitly clear that compliance was not optional. "Sir," the lead guard said, his voice cutting through the remaining tension like a razor, "we need you to step away from the table, leave all company-issued devices on the surface, and follow us downstairs." The VP looked around the room one last time, searching for an ally, a witness, or a savior. But the HR director was looking at her tablet. The general counsel was already drafting an emergency disclosure note, and Elena was simply watching him with the detached curiosity of a scientist, observing a predictable chemical reaction. He swallowed hard, his face a mask of bitter defeat. With trembling hands, he reached into his jacket, pulled out his company phone and his encrypted security badge, and dropped them onto the glass table. They landed with a dull, hollow clatter, the definitive, unceremonious sound of a corporate death sentence. As the guards closed in on either side of him and guided him toward the elevator, he stopped at the threshold. He turned his head back toward Elena, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You think you won, Elena? You think they'll reward you for this? All you did was make yourself the most dangerous person in a building full of people with things to hide." The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off his voice and leaving the boardroom in a sudden, ringing silence. Elena stood still for a long moment, watching the elevator indicator numbers rapidly descend toward the lobby. She knew he was wrong about the reward, but deep down, as she looked at the general counsel who was already making a frantic call to the external audit firm, she knew the VP was right about one thing. By exposing the biggest fraud in the company's history, she hadn't just cleaned up the 14th floor. She had just put a massive, glowing target directly on her own back. The fallout from an executive execution is never tidy. Within 20 minutes of the VP's forced exit, the 14th floor resembled a hive that had been violently disrupted. The soft, ambient morning light was replaced by the harsh, blinding glare of emergency operational protocols. Elena stood by the central server access terminal, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with a rhythmic, reassuring click. On her secondary monitor, she watched the internal security feeds. The VP's office was already being cordoned off with digital lockouts. His remote access privileges were being stripped line by line, code by code, systematically erasing his existence from the company's neural network. The general counsel paced the length of the glass wall behind her, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. His voice was a frantic, hushed whisper, a sharp departure from his usual courtroom composure. "Yes, it's confirmed," the counsel muttered into the receiver, his eyes darting toward Elena's back. "It's not just a compliance breach, it's a systemic siphoning structure. We need the forensic accounting team on site by 9, and lock down the press release draft. No one speaks to external media until the board meets." Elena didn't look up from her monitors, but she caught every word. The corporate machine was doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect the collective organism by sacrificing the infected limb. But as she watched the data packets stream across her screen, she noticed a strange anomaly in the network logs. The VP's credentials were dead. His administrative keys had been revoked at exactly 7:12 a.m. Yet a ghost signal was still pinging the main database from a localized terminal inside the building, an encrypted outbound stream that shouldn't have been active. The data wasn't just being wiped, it was being actively mirrored to an external, untraceable cloud server. Her breath caught in her throat. She zoomed in on the IP origin point, her heart hammering against her ribs. The signal wasn't coming from the VP's abandoned office. It was routing directly through the executive suite on the floor below, the COO's private office. Elena's hand froze over the mouse. The cold realization washed over her, freezing the adrenaline in her veins. The COO hadn't opened Report Section 8 at 7:03 a.m. because he was surprised by the fraud. He had opened it because he was tracking how close she was getting to the truth. The VP hadn't been the criminal mastermind. He had been the lightning rod, intentionally positioned to take the fall if the audit trail ever broke through the digital firewall. A soft, polite cough from the doorway shattered the silence of the server room. Elena closed the log window with a lightning-fast shortcut, her face instantly smoothing into a mask of professional calm as she turned around. Standing in the doorway was the COO's executive assistant, holding a sleek silver tablet and wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Elena," the assistant said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "The Chief Operating Officer has finished his preliminary review of your excellent report. He would like to thank you personally. Please come down to his office. He's waiting for you alone." The executive suite on the 13th floor was designed to soothe and intimidate in equal measure. Thick, cream-colored carpet swallowed the sound of Elena's heels, and the walls were lined with minimalist art that screamed expensive compliance. The air here didn't smell like stale espresso. It smelled of white tea, cedarwood, and unshakable institutional power. When Elena stepped through the double oak doors, the COO didn't look up immediately. He was framed by the brilliant morning sun, sitting behind a monolithic desk made of dark slate. He was casually scrolling through a tablet, a half-eaten croissant resting on a fine china plate to his left. He looked like a man enjoying a peaceful Thursday morning, not an executive who had just witnessed his top deputy dragged out by security. "Sit down, Elena," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him without breaking his gaze from the screen. Elena sat, keeping her posture perfectly straight. She placed her hands in her lap, making a conscious effort to keep her fingers perfectly still. On the 13th floor, nervousness was interpreted as guilt, and confidence was interpreted as a threat. She needed to look like a loyal soldier who had simply done her job too well. The COO finally set the tablet down, leaning forward and interlocking his fingers. He studied her for a long, agonizing moment. "Report Section 8, he began, his voice a rich baritone rumble that exuded absolute control. "Remarkable work, truly. Forensic accounting teams usually take months to map out this kind of architecture. You did it in 72 hours, largely on your own time." "The anomalies were hard to ignore, sir," Elena replied, keeping her tone strictly analytical. Once the digital signatures matched the dissolved Delaware entity, the rest of the ledger fell into place automatically. Naturally, the COO smiled, a thin, sharp movement of his lips. "And you've always been exceptionally good at finding things that fall into place. But tell me, Elena, as a data architect, you understand the concept of a closed loop, don't you?" The question hung heavily in the air. Elena felt the phantom weight of the network logs she had just seen on the 14th floor. The active outbound stream, the ghost signal routing data from this exact room to an untraceable cloud server. "I do," Elena said carefully. "A closed loop ensures that data doesn't leak outside the designated perimeter." "Exactly." The COO nodded, leaning back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The company has experienced a localized infection. The VP was a disappointment. Greed is a terribly predictable flaw. But the infection has been excised, the loop is closed, and the board is satisfied. The file is officially archived." He reached out, tapped his tablet, and Elena felt her personal phone vibrate in her blazer pocket. She didn't need to look at it to know what it was. A notification of a lateral promotion, a massive compliance bonus, or a non-disclosure agreement disguised as an executive retention package. Your loyalty to the stability of this firm will be rewarded, the COO continued, his voice dropping to a softer, more dangerous register. But every system has a capacity limit. You've reached the ceiling of what needs to be uncovered here. Do we understand each other? It was the ultimate corporate crossroads. She could accept the payout, turn a blind eye to the ghost signal, and pretend the VP was the sole villain of the story. She could survive, climb higher, and become part of the very system she had spent her life auditing. Or she could look at the tiny blinking blue light on her own smartwatch, the one indicating that the secondary encrypted backup of the COO's real-time data mirroring had just finished downloading to her private server. Elena looked at the man who held her entire career in his hands, smiled a polite professional smile, and stood up. "Perfectly, sir," Elena said smoothly. "The loop is closed." As she walked out of the office and the heavy oak doors shut behind her, she let out the breath she had been holding. The VP was gone, but the real game had just begun. And this time she wasn't just tracking the data, she was holding the detonator.